understanding our past, embracing our present, charting the way forward into our future. Together, eliminating poverty, embracing justice, peace, and togetherness. The Global View on Q. Networking Dominica with the rest of the world. The experts are in the house. From Dominica, Canada, the Caribbean, the United States, Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world. Engaging all Dominicans at home and abroad on our agriculture, our economy, our foreign relations, our justice system, our governance, our international competitiveness, our education, our world-class festivals and entertainment, sports, politics, regional cooperation, and much more. Globally positioning Dominica within the Caribbean. Join the conversation on the Global View on Q. Tune in, call us, have your say. The Global View on Q, only on Q95, the big station.
Pleasant good evening to you at home or in your vehicle if you are on the road or at work or listening on the radio or on the internet in Dominica or abroad. Thank you so much for choosing Q95. This is the Global View on Q. A very warm welcome to all of our Q family listeners at home and globally. It is Tuesday, 24th March 2026, the 12th Tuesday of 2026, and it's just about 8:02 p.m. in the studios at Q95, the big station. We're live on our radio frequencies on QTV. Please follow us on Facebook and on YouTube at Q95 FM Radio. Share the live, like our pages or on your phone numbers are on the homepage of our website at www.q95da.com. Get the latest breaking news and reviews on Q95 because you know it's true if you hear it on Q. We continue to revive the spirit of graciousness, love, peace, prosperity, and unity among our Kalinago and Afro-Caribbean brothers and sisters. This Tuesday night, it is our 9th Global View on Q show for 2026, and we continue to engage with our local, regional, and global Q family listeners and friends of Dominica. I'm Sheridan Gregoire, Mr. G. With me is my co-host, Justice Dr. Irving Andre, former CSA General Secretary Alvin Thomas, Professor Alex Bruno, and former Dominica UN Ambassador Crispin Gregoire. Good evening to all you gentle people. Tonight's topic is, what is the future of U.S.-Cuba relations in the face of U.S. President Donald Trump's stated intent to take over Cuba? What role can Caricom play in shaping that future? And what does a sustainable cooperative way forward look like for Cuba? Should Cuba choose a path to become a multi-party democracy in this hemisphere? Tonight, we will turn our attention to one of the most enduring and complex relationships in modern Caribbean geopolitics, the evolving dynamic between the United States and Cuba. More than 6 decades after the Cuban Revolution and the imposition of U.S. embargo, Cuba remains at the center of a geopolitical conversation that touches on sovereignty, economic development, migration, and regional stability. For the Caribbean, this should not be an abstract issue. The region, through the leadership of Caricom, has long maintained strong diplomatic and cooperative ties with Cuba, particularly in healthcare, education, and disaster response. Yet today, Cuba faces mounting economic pressures as the broader geopolitical landscape is shifting with global powers increasingly active in the Caribbean. We will discuss the historical context of Cuba-US relations, the origins of the Cuban Revolution, the breakdown of US-Cuba relations, the evolution of the US embargo and key moments like the Cold War, the post-Soviet period, and the Obama era thaw out. We will look at the current state of Cuba, its economic challenges of inflation, shortages, migration, internal reforms, and pressures. Look at the role of external partners like China, Russia, Latin America, and Caricom. We'll examine public sentiment in Cuba and the domestic political factors in the US itself that are shaping US policy on Cuba. We will look at Caricom's role in terms of its historic recognition of Cuba in 1972, its consistent advocacy for lifting the embargo, for regional cooperation in healthcare, disaster response, etc., and its potential role as a diplomatic bridge. We will also look at the way forward, pathways to normalization, the role of dialogue and diplomacy, the economic integration opportunities, and the importance of regional unity. Caricom has consistently stood for dialogue and not division. The future of Cuba will shape the future of Caribbean stability. Normalization in Cuba is not just a political issue, it is an economic and humanitarian issue. So, the future of Cuba and its relationship with the United States is not just a matter for two nations. It is a question that affects the entire Caribbean and indeed the broader hemisphere. I will have some follow up questions and point out some issues and offer some possible solutions a little later on based on the submissions of our panelists. So we look forward to the contributions of Justice Dr. Irving Andre, former CSA General Secretary Alvin Thomas, former Dominican Ambassador Crispin Gregor, and Professor Alex Bruno on this topic. What is the future of US Cuba relations in the face of US President Donald Trump's stated intent to take over Cuba? What role can CARICOM play in shaping that future? And what does a sustainable cooperative way forward look like for Cuba? And should Cuba choose a path to become a multi party democracy in this hemisphere? So, as usual, invite you, our Q family and friends of Dominica, to help us give our usual huge shout out and big thank you to our farmers, our healthcare providers, our frontline workers, police and fire officers, teachers, doctors, nurses, and public and private sector patriots, and friends of Dominica at home and abroad. We welcome each and every Dominican and friend of Dominica to the Global View on Q. We embrace you wherever you are, in every nook and cranny, in every village, in every community, at home in Dominica, in the region, and globally. Thank you, Sherwin, as usual, for keeping us on the air, and thank you, Lambi, on the console directing the traffic tonight. As usual, we will take your calls. As you know, the people's voice is always a priority on Q, on the Global View on Q. So call us anytime during the program. Lambi will signal us when you call. My co-host and guest panelists will expand and deliver on their own ideas on tonight's topic. As usual, each panelist will divide their contributions into 4 5 minute presentations, and we'll get to make a closing remark. But somebody's mic is open. Could you please mute your mic because some feedback is coming through? So I go now to Justice Dr. Irving Andre for his first 5 minute opening comments on tonight's topic.
Thank you for your introduction, Mr. G. Let me commend my panelists for being here this evening to offer us their wisdom and hopefully not my cold. And let me thank the listeners and obviously Dr. Lambe, who is a shopper, really, in terms of hosting and controlling these Tuesday evening discussions. Who will have mercy on us? There must be something in the air, and it could be the prospect of U.S. intervention. Now, obviously, there's a clamor about U.S. intervention. There's some serious concern about Trump's somewhat shameless declaration that it will be an honor for him to take Cuba. But let us get something out of the way. Trump is not an aberration. Trump is not an exception. This is just the latest manifestation of a long line of authoritarianism exhibited by the United States insofar as Cuba is concerned. Cuba was discovered by guess who? Well, discovered might be the wrong word, by Christopher Columbus, because he met a number of indigenous groups and organizations in Cuba at the time that he blundered into Cuba. And suffice it to say that over the next 2 or 3 decades, Cuba remained, after it was basically invaded by the Spanish, it remained a possession of the Spaniards. And note the word, please, a possession, because that essentially has been the fate of so many Caribbean islands from the advent of Christopher Columbus right up to the present times. There was somewhat of an exchange on about in the 19th century when after the American Revolution, after the fall of the Haitian slave economy, and Cuba became an area where the slave plantation took root under the Spanish initially. And as it took root, all the nations in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the United States, treated it as if it was the brand new woman on the block. It attracted suitors. And in that world, the most powerful had the inner track in terms of gaining her affections. And when I say gaining affections, I mean making her rife for exploitation. So that what you had is that by the late 19th century, you had an Americans taking on the Spanish to try to establish dominance and sovereignty over Cuba. You had, for example, a war, I believe, at the end of the 19th century, 1898 or thereabouts, when America basically arrested Cuba from the clutches of the Spaniards, and thenceforth, the Americans remained the dominant power over Cuba up to the present day to a significant extent. Cuba's fate has been determined by the efforts of the Americans to wrestle it to the ground. And that is exactly what has happened. In 1902, for example, after 5 years of U.S. military occupation, Cuba started a national or nationhood struggle. It wasn't quite successful. Cuba's national hero, Jose Marti, was involved in it. He was killed during the so-called Second War of Independence. And with the death or with the fatal blow struck at the forces of independence, the Americans assumed virtually absolute control over that country. They fought 3 wars in the early 20th century, 1902, 1906, 1907. They invaded Cuba. They basically, in 1901, under what is called the Platt Doctrine, they decreed with great humility exhibited by Donald Trump that they had the right to intervene in Cuba at any time. And that's exactly what they did. That's exactly what they did. And suffice it to say, that degree of intervention occurred in the 20th century. In the early 1920s and 1930s, you had the ascendancy of dictatorships in Cuba. You had one gentleman, an army type, who ruled Cuba with an iron hand. And then in the 1930s, you had the ascendancy of a sergeant called Fulgencio Batista. Now, Batista remains a strong person in the annals of Cuban history because he's the gentleman who fled Cuba when he heard that there was a band of revolutionaries led by someone called Fidel Castro and Che Guevara who was about to mount an attack on Havana. So he took the route of bravery, he fled with his entourage, but by that time, Cuba had become a nest for mafia types, a nest from those fleeing justice from the United States, a nest for those who established illegal activities, a nest for corruption. So when Fidel Castro assumed control of Cuba in or about 1959 or thereabouts, Cuba had reached its lowest ebb in terms of the degree of state of governance. And Castro made, from the Americans' perspective, he committed 2 of the gravest sins. The first one, he nationalized much of the industry in Cuba, many of them owned by the Americans. And therefore, he gave the Americans a beef in local parlance to set its sights on regaining control of the island. And even worse, within the same era, he established ties with who? Not with Dominica, but the Russia, the Russia. And after that, it was just a matter of time before the Americans would seek to wrestle Cuba to the ground. We know what happened in 1961. We all have read about the Bay of Pigs, when a ragtag army of ex-Cuban soldiers, and some of them or many of them who had fled to Miami, they tried to invade Cuba. They were decimated. And then we heard about the crisis the 61 Cuban crisis, when Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, he moved some very serious weaponry to Cuba. And John F. Kennedy, the late, he issued an ultimatum: you take them out or we will attack, or something to that effect. Suffice it to say, they came to an uneasy truth. Khrushchev withdraw some of the offensive weaponry, but from then, Cuba was always on America's mind in somewhat of a perverse fashion. I should indicate that even before that, at the end of the 19th century, the Americans had wrestled an agreement with Cuba to give it an indeterminate lease for a naval base in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. So this is the prelude to what is happening now. A persistent presence of the Americans in Cuba, a persistent desire to maintain virtual or absolute control over that island, and a persistent desire, in the face of any type of deviation from that ordained status of American colonyhood, to wrest control or to reestablish American control of the island. And since then, since the early 60s, we've had these economic policies that basically sought to corral Cuba's industry. Now, Cuba was able to maintain a sense of independence through three forces: the creative energies of its own people, one. Secondly, the support of sympathetic governments, particularly the Soviet Union. The inconvenient truth is that Cuba's economy was always heavily influenced or heavily subsidized by first the Russians, and in the last 20 years or thereabouts, or even less, the Venezuelans. Cuba established, again with the help of some of these countries, the Soviet Union, China to some extent, a liberation theology or philosophy, which saw Cuba, particularly the heyday of that philosophy, if I recall correctly, was in the 1970s, when it played a seminal role in fighting back the forces of apartheid in South Africa. And Cuba was very much instrumental in ensuring the independence of a number of countries in Africa, whether it's Angola, whether it's Mozambique, and others. But Cuban soldiers paid with their blood the price and the liberation of these countries from the thraldom of racism and European imperialism, whether from the Portuguese or other European countries. And during all that time, as I said, the Americans will never give up on what they perceived to be the injustice of the nationalization, which went on in the late 50s. They continued with different policies. Some, like President Obama, which you mentioned earlier, Mr. G, somewhat eased some of those restrictions, but there were always restrictions. And what added fuel to the desire to maintain those restrictions was the growing community of emigres from Cuba in Florida. That has been the governing factor in terms of the obsession with Cuba. It has been the governing factor in terms of this fellow called Marco Rubio, whose parents were Cuban, and it remained, that obsession has remained. And obviously you can well imagine that someone like Donald Trump, who ran on a platform of stopping all foreign wars, but power is very intoxicating. I know we haven't learned that lesson in Dominica, but power is very intoxicating. Putting the most powerful military in the world in the hands of a Donald Trump, for God's sakes. Anyone could have seen what would happen. And especially given the ease with which he was able to get Maduro, that just whetted his appetite. And so with Iran, now he's run into some serious problems, but that is not our focus this evening. And he already served notice. Despite the fact that the war against Iran is floundering in a sense, he served notice that the next person on his plate, his appetite will only be whetted if they deal with the Cuban question. And the Cuban question is to basically overthrow this quote unquote communist government, establish America's right to control it as it has done since the 19th century. And this is where we're at right now. And what has been the response of Caricom, I believe? Well, the response from some islands is we do not want to antagonize the Americans. We do not want to give Trump an excuse to come after us. And trust me, Donald Trump does have an excuse to come after some of our lovely little islands. Those who've been peddling passports, those who've been breaching UN sanctions against the exportation of oil from Iran, those who've been selling passports to corrupt Iranian officials who are looking for a safe haven. The Americans have their sights on those countries. And hence the efforts of the Americans and the British and sadly the Europeans very soon to establish restrictions on Dominicans. Is it because Dominicans are breaking the laws in America that attracts this kind of attitude? No, it is because they perceive Dominica and some of the other islands as threats to the security architecture of the United States. Those leaders who've sold their souls or sold their countries for a few dollars more, those who've given diplomatic passports to upright citizens such as Alison Madueke from Nigeria, some of these Iranian generals, they have basically focused on those countries. And this is why many of these Caribbean islands, they will not go out of their way to support the Cubans because they fear retribution from the United States. Obviously, there's other countries that have tried to assist, but they do so at their own peril, but they do so on humanitarian grounds. We know that in a few weeks ago, there was a flotilla of ships bringing aid to the Cubans in terms of health, health items and so on for their hospitals, for their sick. But the fate of Cuba is still very much in the balance because Trump will never stop or never cease his plans to do what so many other American presidents have failed to do, to finally deal and settle the Cuban problem. And from his perspective, aided and abetted by Rubio, the only solution to that problem is to overthrow or to engineer the fall of the communist government in Cuba. And that is where we are today. And the question is, what is the Caribbean government's response from that declared, stated policy? And so far, we've heard a few token responses, a few token assertions. We've heard about peace, but nothing of action. Not even a boatload of green bananas have been sent. And so the Caribbean people just have to wait to see what's going to transpire and to find out what our Caribbean governments are going to do. Are they more intent on saving their own skins, or are they more intent on giving hope to those Cuban persons, the Cuban citizenry, which quite frankly are the biggest victims of that type of policy towards Cuba? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andre, for this historical context of the Cuba situation and the relationship with the United States. And Alvin, as Dr. Andre pointed out, with the advent of the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara, and then this other cap there, obviously you had a migration of all these business people, and many of these capitalists from Cuba, and they obviously migrated to Florida. That has created a series of major lobby in Florida against Cuba. And of course, as Dr. Andre pointed out, Marco Rubio's parents were from Cuba, and they too fled Cuba with the advent of, these people, or the Cuban Revolution. So the question is now, why does Cuba still matter in 2026? I mean, Cuba remains strategically important due to its geographic location, its political history since the Cuban Revolution, and its role in regional systems like healthcare and disaster response. And additionally, in today's geopolitical environment, Cuba is part of a broader conversation about influence in the Caribbean, particularly involved in global powers like China. So, what are your thoughts based on taking off from where Dr. Andre left off, Alvin?
Yes, thank you, Mr. G. Let me say a pleasant good evening to you, Mr. G, and my fellow panelists, Alex, Crispin, Irvin, and the big guy, Lambi, in the console. Lambi might have to shave that Cuban beard that he has there, man, Lambi. They might take you for a Cuban. But I want to thank you and to our listeners who are queued in to the program this evening. And to answer your question, Mr. G, and I think let me commend my friend Irvin, Dr. Andre, for a splendid overview of presenting the situation with where Cuba is now, where it came from, and where it is now, and the American influence. But what I want to do, Mr. G, to answer your question that you posed to me, I want to use that first 5 minutes that is allotted to me because Dr. Andre ended on a very good note. He says, what is the Caribbean government response? And he talked about the hope of the citizens, the people of Cuba. And I think we all know, as Dr. Andre has so articulated presented, the historical context of where Cuba is now. What happened then and what has taken Cuba to where we are today. But it's ironical to note, though, that given what is not being done from our end, when I say our end, I mean from the Caribbean end, that the person who happens to be the chairman of Caricom now is a student and a graduate of Cuba, Dr. Terence Drew. So what I want to do with my 5 minutes that I'm allotted to, I want to reference, for the benefit of those who may not have had the opportunity to read a very striking and important article that was published just 3 days ago. It's dated March the 21st by Calvin G. Brown of Wired JA. And the caption of that article says, Caribbean beyond words and beyond shame. Caricom pledged Cuba's relief 3 weeks ago. The ships came from elsewhere. And the article reads, as the 650 activists from 33 nations, you heard Dr. Andre, made reference to who is bold enough to assist and what has done. But to date, at the time that article was written, as many as 33 nations, and you'll hear who are some of the nations, sailed into Havana on Saturday with 20 tons of aid. The 15-member Caricom community, which promised Cuban humanitarian support in short order within a month, has still not dispatched as much as a crate. The summit theme that they just held in St. Kitts just a couple days ago was beyond words, the irony is unbelievable. They came from Italy. They came from France. They came from Brazil. They came from Colombia, from Mexico, and the United States. They came by air and by sea, clutching solar panels and cancer medication, sacks of rice, and a collective refusal to look away. On Saturday, as 3 vessels from our American convoy to Cuba, that's what it was termed, carved through Caribbean waters into Havana Harbor, carrying 20 tons of humanitarian relief, the 650-strong flotilla of conscience delivered not only supplies to suffering people, it delivered an indictment of a regional body that chooses caution over conviction. The Caribbean community has been notably, conspicuously, shamefully absent from that harbor. Within a month, the clock has run out. The record is unambiguous. At the 50th regular meeting of the Conference of Caricom Heads of Government, convened in Bastille, St. Kitts and Nevis, from February 24th to the 27th, Caricom Chair and St. Kitts and Nevis Prime Minister Dr. Terence Drew, who, as I indicated a few minutes ago, is a Cuban graduate, stood before the Caribbean press and made a commitment. With respect to Cuba, I quote, and the humanitarian effort, he declared, we are going to respond on the humanitarian end in a short order, within a month. Heads of government, he said, has agreed that Caricom would take steps to support humanitarian effort. A coordinated response was being prepared. A detailed plan would be finalized shortly. That was 23 days ago. Today, if we add on, it would be 24, 25 days ago. Today, since that time, Cuba is still waiting. Not a vessel has sailed, as Dr. Andre rightly indicated a few minutes ago. Not a cargo has been assembled. Not a plan has been published. The team Drew promised would be formed to determine Cuba's requirement has not, to any public knowledge, been formed at all. The article goes on to say, to understand Cubans' paralysis, one must recall who else was in the room in Bastille. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who flew into St. Kitts for high-level talks with Caribbean leaders on February 25th. The very day solidarity with Cuba was being discussed. The joint statement that he made spoke of a highly constructive and frank conversation. The community declared itself mindful of the extent to which the region can be negatively affected and carefully couch any Cuban commitment in the language of maintaining regional stability. In plain English, therefore, Caricom pledged to help Cuba while Rubio sat across the table. And since Rubio left, that pledge has quietly evaporated. The January 29th executive order threatening tariffs on any nation supplying oil to Cuba has already demonstrated Washington's willingness to punish solidarity. Caricom, it appears, heard that warning clearly, even as it performed concern for the cameras in Bastille. The contrast, therefore, between Caricom's inertia and the international community's action is a portrait in moral clarity. Brazil, not a Caribbean nation, pledged 20,000 tons of food. China dispatched a vessel with 60,000 tons of rice. Chile sent a parliamentary delegation with supplies. Mexico has now shipped aid on 4 separate occasions. And as this past Saturday that I indicated, which was the 21st, nations and 121 organizations mobilized 650 delegates to physically sail to Cuba's side, carrying medicine for cancer patients, solar panels to restore light to blackout hospitals, and food for families who have endured 5 years of tightening hardship. We cannot allow this collective punishment. We cannot normalize it, said David Alder of Progressive International, one of the Convey's principal organizers. The people, these are the voices of Caribbean government. They are the voices of civil society, filling the vacuum that regional leaders have left gaping. Jamaica Prime Minister Andrew Holness, to his credit, spoke plainly in Bastille. A prolonged crisis in Cuba will not remain confined to Cuba. And I think Dr. Andrew alluded to that. He warned it will affect migration. And that is based even on the question that you asked me earlier. Security and economic stability across the Caribbean. So it's not just migration to Miami, it's migration within the region, within Caricom. Chairman Drew went further, recalling that the 7 years he spent studying medicine in Havana. I studied in Cuba. I lived in Cuba for 7 years. I have friends there. Touching words, warm words. 3 weeks later, still only words. The Cuban government is not confused about who has and who has not answered the call. President Miguel Diaz-Canel told the social media on Saturday as the convoy approached, they bring shipment of aid to combat the attempt to suffocate us. Solidarity always returns to those who practice it. So he is recognizing, therefore, Mr. G, that see who is providing the solidarity to them. The people sailing into this harbor today are not from Georgetown or Kingston or Bridgetown. They're from Rome. They're from St. Paulo. They're from Mexico City. There is a cruelty in irony when one lives, when lives are at stake, Caricom chose the theme in Baste, Beyond Words, Action Today, for a thriving, sustainable Caricom, for its landmark 50th summit. It was meant as a declaration of renewed regional purpose, a promise that the body forged in the Treaty of Chaguaramas would at the 50th meeting hold finally match rhetoric with resolve. Okay. Instead, on the single most urgent humanitarian test that has confronted the region since that summit closed, Caricom has offered Cuba precisely what the theme promised to transcend: words and nothing more. So, Mr. G, I use my time to read through that article because it captures in essence what we are discussing here tonight. Okay. Because all of the historical aspect of it, while it is important, there are people now as we speak, now as we're on this program, that are dying, that are suffering, that need help. And we in the region, considering that Jamaica is just 150 kilometers south of Cuba, Bahamas is right there, all members of Caricom, is yet to send not even a bag of rice to Cuba. And given all the graduates who study in Cuba, who benefited from Cuba, and what we have benefited from Cuba as well, from the health support of the health team, it's really a shame.
Okay, thanks a lot for this opening remarks, Alvin. Good that you pointed out this article that has been in circulation. I want to go to Professor Alex Bruno now. Now, Alex, the question I have to put to you, you've heard Dr. Andre giving us the historical context. You've heard Alvin point out what has been lacking in the response of Caricom to the Cuban crisis that is now facing. But the question is the U.S. embargo still justified? I mean, a balanced approach could be to acknowledge U.S. concerns about Cuban human rights and the Cuban governance. The embargo is one of the longest-standing foreign policy tools in modern history. While it was rooted in the Cold War dynamics, many in the Caribbean view it as an outdated and counterproductive. Caricom has consistently advocated for engagement rather than isolation, arguing that dialogue offers a more effective pathway, and yet Caricom is not responding to Cuba's needs at this time. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. Thanks to Andre and Thomas who went before me, and I'm looking forward to Crispin, who will follow my opening remarks. I won't be longer than 5 minutes, I promise, but I'm happy that you asked me about the embargo, because embargo, which had been used as a tool, and even before I get into that, let me thank Dr. Andre for really setting the platform, because I actually came with a prepared historical, political context, and I realized it was an exercise in futility. And I dare say he pretty much did a much more, I guess, charismatic job than I would have done with the introduction. So thank you for that, Dr. Andre. I learned a little bit from you in terms of how you presented, and I'm going to adopt that in the future. I really did enjoy your introduction of the topic. I'm happy I did the work, but yes, you presenting it made me feel good about it. Okay, embargo. The US has put in place a crippling embargo on Cuba for the better part of the life of the government. Of course, the post-revolutionary Cuban government, because America was certainly in bed with Batista prior. And of course, we can go back to kind of delve a bit in the history that Dr. Andre did, but we don't have to really do that. Let's move it from 1950s and onwards. And if you go to Cuba today, you will see as if time would have stood still in terms of the automobile, the sort of architecture, the lifestyle. Cuba has progressed, but Cuba has not really moved because of the crippling embargo, which I would think has to be an outdated tool that is hurting not the regime, but the people, the Cuban people, the beautiful, wonderful Cuban people, who for the better part of last week and this week had been enduring darkness. 10 million people under a darkened sky. Probably that does something to excite or humble the people, but it's never a good thing to think of our brothers and sisters just next door cannot enjoy the basic amenities of a modern life. And that is thanks to the embargo that has been placed on the country. For those people who quite do not understand what an embargo is pretty much a draconian restriction on a country in terms of its bilateral trade and dealing with other countries. And because America, of its might, economic and military might, political might, control the West and East, North and South, as Andre alluded to earlier on, or at least attempts to do so, it has placed this crippling blow by the way of this embargo on Cuba. And the last strike was when Maduro was taken out with his wife, and they're now dwelling in a jailhouse in New York in the name of narco trafficking. But I heard the President of America said it was for other reasons that I really don't want to get into at this point in time, because there are so many reasons that has been cited for that. The short story is that is where Cuba got the latest blow. And that was not quite an embargo. It was like taking the oil away from the livelihood. And I mean that literally, from the Cubans. So that accounted to where we are today in terms of the Cuban problem, the Cuban crisis that we are actually dealing with. Alvin spoke about Caricom and what they're doing and what they're not doing. And I believe in conversation with you, Mr. G, earlier, I say Caricom can be mere spectators. What can Caricom realistically be expected to do when all the Caricom leaders are pretty much, let me not say all, when the great majority of Caricom leaders are pretty much compromised in terms of dealings, etc., etc., etc. Again, we don't have to get into that. But Caricom pretty much will look on hopelessly while our brothers and sisters in Cuba perish, so to speak. I believe that the Caricom and the Caribbean is being led by a particular political ethos, which is led or influenced by an elite tendency that controls the power apparatus. So I believe that, and if you look at the Caribbean countries and the elections, you pretty much see the same kind of blueprint of how you win elections. And that is controlled by one group of elites. And the leaders of those government or of those regimes or of those teams have pretty much bought into the blueprint and are existing in a sort of selfish, greed-driven approach. And again, that's not really blanketing everybody, but that's just the general tendency in terms of what I see happening in the Caribbean. Certainly in Caricom, and our friend or sister, Kamala from Trinidad, kind of called it almost right. with a criticism or observation of Caricom. So I want to kind of curtail my opening here because I'm looking forward to be bouncing ideas from my brothers and you, Mr. G, on the panel. But I hope I would have dealt with your prompt in terms of the embargo. And the question was, is it time that we release the embargo? Of course, it is over time. It's more beyond time because it's not working. It has never really worked to elevate the country. It has crippled the people. And as such, it has made the people in a situation. In fact, what America actually did the embargo is extract people from Cuba. The wet foot, dry foot, I guess Crispin could speak to that. Immigration policy, where Cubans, no matter how you get to America, you would be extracted. And when you take human resource from a country, you pretty much take the most important resource. And that's what America would have done over the past 60, 70 years, in addition to the embargo. So it was like a perfect storm that Cuba have experienced. And I believe if we do what we have to do well, we can kind of have a revival of the Cuban Renaissance over the next, let's say, generation, or maybe two, if according to how we work. But I think we can get Cuba back. We just have to be willing and ready and able to do so by standing on behalf of the people of Cuba and representing. I think diplomacy is going to be the way. This military intervention that the President of America has promised is going to put things even more deadly and dire. That's not going to fix the Cuban problem. It may fix the problem of the few who want to benefit from Cuba's resources, but it won't fix the country generally. All right, I'm going to stop now. I'm going to yield back to you, Mr. G, and I'm looking forward to continuing the engagement.
All right, Alex, thanks for this wonderful opening remarks. I want to go now to former Ambassador Crispin Gregoire. Crispin, you've heard the introductory remarks of Dr. Andre. You've heard Alvin, and now you've heard Alex. The Cuba is definitely facing a crisis today, and obviously, the U.S. President Donald Trump has decided that he's going to take over Cuba. And in fact, he said he appointed Senator Marco Rubio to take charge of Cuba. So
Secretary of State Marco Rubio to take charge of Cuba. So it is facing a crisis today, experiencing significant economic pressure, characterized by inflation, day-to-day living shortages. You can see from the lack of oil and so on, lack of energy. And it's facing migration challenges and also undergoing gradual internal adjustments. Of course, Cuba has been undergoing internal adjustments for some time. The situation is serious but not static, and is influenced by internal policy decisions and external constraints like sanctions and embargoes. So what role do you think, Crispin, looking at all of that, what role do you think Caricom can really play, being uniquely positioned as a trusted partner to Cuba? At least Cuba thought Caricom was a trusted partner and a long-standing ally of the Western democracies. Can its role be to advocate for dialogue to maintain regional stability and act as a diplomatic bridge where appropriate? Over to you, Crispin.
Yes, good evening, Mr. G and Dr. Andre, your co-host, and to my fellow panelists, Professor Alex Bruno and Alvin Thomas, and of course, let me hail Lambi and Sherwin. Mr. G, I think we are on the edge of another crisis. This time focused on a country in our region. We already had what's called the decapitation of the Maduro government, and we begin to see a pattern that is emerging, which I will talk about. But I wanted to first of all respond to your question: is what is the role for Caricom? Well, I have always believed that one of the roles of Caricom is to have tried to meet the U.S. as heads of government, as opposed to their foreign ministers. I believe that if the heads of government met with the White House, maybe that could signal a more definitive stance of the Caricom. But the reality is that the Caricom is not united on this particular question of the U.S. intervention. And not only is the U.S. The Caricom not united, we also have the country Dominican Republic, which is close ally of the U.S. and was one of the countries that was invited to Mar-a-Lago. And we saw 3 Caribbean countries at the Mar-a-Lago summit: Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Dominican Republic, which is, of course, not part of CARICOM, but hopefully in the future, I think the future direction of CARICOM will have to include both the Dominican Republic and Cuba. And then the question of what happens to Puerto Rico remains a question that has to be addressed in time. I think that CARICOM has been sort of reduced to a shell of what it used to be, as a strong advocate for non-alignment, as a strong advocate for South-South cooperation, as a strong advocate for keeping the Caribbean a zone of peace. All of these things seem to me to be in crisis. The zone of peace is already in shambles because the U.S. is in the region with warships, poised to do further military interventions. And I have to say, though, that the U.S. is not finished with Venezuela. What they have elected to do, and that seems to be an approach that they're taking, and that is not to bring about regime change necessarily, or in the way that we understood how regime change occurred from past practices of the United States in the Caribbean. What we are seeing is somewhat of they call it a decapitation of the regime. So you saw that in Venezuela and you saw that in Iran, where in Iran they killed the Ayatollah. So they removed the leader of the government. In Venezuela, the same thing. And now President Trump is saying that the president of Cuba must resign. That I don't think is going to happen. Maybe he can be removed by other means, whether it's decapitation. But it seems as though that what is planned for Cuba is something similar to what we've seen in Venezuela and what we've seen in Iran in the last couple of weeks. So the idea is to not do what was done in Iraq and Afghanistan to try to create a new democratic political order, but rather force those countries to yield to U.S. military pressure, and then the U.S. can get them to do whatever it wants. And that seems to be sort of a new doctrine that is emerging from Washington. Now, the question is, will that work in Cuba? I hasten to add that any kind of intervention in Cuba by the United States will be met with military response from the Cubans. And let me hasten to add that the Cubans are one of the most disciplined military forces in Latin America outside the US. And should the US make the mistake of putting any troops on Cuba, you can imagine there's going to be a fight. So we need to begin to wrap our heads around what will unfold and the implications of that for our region. I want to thank Dr. Andre for giving us a very holistic historical perspective about Cuba over the last 67 years since the revolution. When I think about the range of possibilities of what could happen in Cuba, I always think about what happened in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991. And that is, all of these Eastern European countries that were part of the Soviet bloc, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the communist regimes brought about multi-party democracy or multi-party systems. I can't say it's democracy in Eastern Europe. So all of those countries departed from a one-party system. And I believe that Cuba would likely be forced towards a multi-party system by the United States. I'm leaning on the side of sticking my neck out to say that the US will not likely remove the Cuban Communist Party from power in the short run. They might see that as a longer term objective. They don't want to make the mistake they made in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So the question is, will that introduce a new instability in Cuba? I think yes. How does Cuba adapt to this new challenge of having to open up the country, both in terms of in the economic sphere and in the political sphere? Now, I've seen the response of the Cuban deputy foreign minister, and he said that he admitted to talks with the US. That was one. And he said that, and I'm going to quote him, that the Cuban government is open to a fluid commercial relationship with US companies. But that did not pacify Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. He quickly responded on the 17th of March that this offer does not go far enough, unquote. So, what is it that the US wants from Cuba? One is for the president to resign, and Mr. Trump has joked about making Marco Rubio the czar of Cuba, like they made my former professor from Afghanistan. They made him the czar of Afghanistan after the US invaded Afghanistan. I'm talking about Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the sort of the governor of Afghanistan after the US governor of Afghanistan. Of course, Khalilzad had to run for his life. Well, he negotiated the peace with the Taliban, and he's disappeared from the scene. I should mention, for transparency, he was my academic advisor. So I learned some things from him, Alex, that I can share with you all. But anyway, having said that, coming back to Cuba, I'll say that we better brace ourselves for an unstable reality with Cuba. And what worries me the most is the point that Alex pointed out about migration. The waves of refugees that could inundate the Florida shores. Of course, that's one scenario. Another scenario is that if Uncle Sam is now back in Havana, maybe people don't want to leave with the hope that Uncle Sam will solve all of their problems, which I don't think Sam cares. Sam just wants to control the resources that's in Cuba, and there are resources. There's nickel. There's they still produce a good amount of sugar, not as much as they used to, and there are other rare earth minerals that they have. So let us not think it's all political. There are economic considerations, and then there is the properties that were confiscated from US citizens in 1959, 1960, 1961, and so on. a lot of properties were nationalized by the Cuban government. Well, there is an aspect of US law that deals with that and actually expands the punitive sanctions on the Cuban government. And that was in 1993, I believe. Or was it 1996? But it was called the Helms-Burton.
96.
What year, Alex?
96. Helms-Burton's law.
Helms-Burton, 1996. Officially known as the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, which aimed to strengthen the U.S. embargo against Cuba and promote a transition to democracy on the island. The act did something that the embargo before did not do. It extended the territorial application of the initial embargo to apply to foreign companies who are trading with Cuba. So if you're a foreign company and you're trading with Cuba, you would be penalized under the Helms-Burton Act, right? And that was one of the reasons why you might remember that Air Jamaica was flying into Cuba at one time. And when that Helms-Burton Act was passed, Air Jamaica had to stop flying into Cuba. And you know, and you couldn't travel to Cuba. If you were in the Caribbean, for you to travel to Cuba, you would have to enter Cuba. They wouldn't stamp your passport. And that's how it's operated. I mean, I would have gone to Cuba as early as 1981, but I didn't want my passport stamped Cuba because I live in the US, and one has to pay attention to these things. So that to remove the embargo is gotten even more onerous, more difficult from 1996, because not only the President of the United States cannot unilaterally approve the end of the embargo. It has to be approved by the US Congress. And I believe in this particular case, it's both the House and the Senate that has to vote on that. And I know that Florida's representatives would not support any kind of lifting of any embargo. Now, I've been reading in the last day what is the response of Latin American writers, people who are writing in the newspapers, the opinion columns. What are they saying about Trump's proposed intervention in Cuba? It's not very encouraging. In fact, Trump is enjoying a lot of support on intervention in Cuba. Of course, from the Cuban exiles, yes, in Florida, but a lot of the Latin American, Latin Hispanic population in the US who are anti-communist support what Trump is proposing to do. And that is a real concern. I read an editorial from the very conservative newspaper in New York called the New York Post, endorsing an intervention in Cuba. So you can begin to see they're preparing the American people for with a good reasoning why intervening in Cuba is important to United States security objectives. I wanted to say that I think both Dr. Andre and Professor Bruno have alluded to the approach of the Trump administration to change completely the political equation of the Caribbean. That is where we are. If Cuba falls, and I expect not necessarily a fall of the Cuban government, but a change in the direction of the Cuban government under the tutelage of the US, I believe that Cuba will come under U.S. Domination. I have difficulty in even uttering that because it's not something I believe should happen. But it seems to me it's duty bound to happen given the posture of the current Trump administration. And I take the Trump administration very, very seriously when they say they're going to do something. They have shown that with Venezuela, and they have shown that with Iran. And the president has said that Cuba is next. So we need to prepare for that. What are the implications for the region? I think that it could, if we have a full conflict, military conflict, it's going to affect navigation in the region. It's going to probably stop the cruise ships from moving. It's going to stop the freight movement of freight. And that's a huge challenge for our region because we are so dependent on food from the United States. So there are a whole range of problems that we don't see now. Like when we heard of what's happening in Iran, we didn't expect the Iranians to put up a fight and bring the conflict into a global context where it's affecting the whole world. A conflict in Cuba could affect the entire Western Hemisphere. And I will say too, and that's the thing we need to brace ourselves for, that any kind of attack on Cuba will elicit a response from anti-American sentiment and views in the region. As we know, there is a strong anti-Yankee aspect to Latin America and the Caribbean, not as much as in the Caribbean, but the Latin Americans, they abhor domination by United States. And I can see solidarity by rebels from South America against U.S. interests in the region. So these are some of the things, Mr. G, I believe that we need to begin to think seriously about as we go on in this next couple of weeks, because I believe that hopefully the U.S. will realize the folly of its ways and come back to the negotiating table with the Iranians. And then when that happens, you can well imagine the pivot back to the Caribbean Sea. And that is where I have great concern. Yes.
Thank you, Crispin, for that intervention. Dr. Andre, I'm going to come to you now, but I want to go to Lambi first to ask him to give out the numbers to our listeners to see if they want to call in and participate in the conversation. But when we come back, I want us to focus really on the Caribbean and the impact of this Cuban intervention of the U.S. on the Caribbean. I mean, Crispin has started outlining some of that, but I want to ask Dr. Andre when we come back to, if he could deal with this question. Is China's presence in the Caribbean changing the equation at all? And the involvement of the People's Republic of China introduces a new layer of strategic competition. Obviously, it has in the Caribbean. This makes Cuba and the wider Caribbean more relevant in global geopolitics. It also reinforces the importance of balanced, independent foreign policies among Caribbean states. So maybe when we come back, Dr. Andre, you may take a look at that. So Lambi, please give out the numbers and let's see if anybody wants to call to participate in the conversation.
The Global View and Q, taking your calls. The numbers are as follow: 449-3095, 449-3096, 449-3097, 616-4257. Those are all local numbers. The international or overseas number is as follows: 305-432-9624. Let me run those one more time. 449-3095-9697, 616-4257, 305-432-9624. 432-9624, and we're standing by for your call. Back to you, Mr. G.
Yes, thanks a lot, Lam. You just make us a signal if the call come in, and we'll stop and take it. Dr. Andre, really, you can see the Chinese presence is strong in the Caribbean now. I mean, the U.S. used to have a much bigger footprint for USAID and US Save the Children Fund, if Crispin is very familiar with, and so on. But today, the U.S. is basically done away with USAID, and its footprint in the Caribbean is very meager. But since then, China has come in, established embassies in some of these islands, and even grants for all kinds of infrastructure in the islands. What are your thoughts on the presence of China in the region in terms of U.S. retaliation?
That's an interesting question. The presence or omnipresence of the Chinese. I'm going to talk about this by reference to a book written by an Antiguan Dominican. Her name is Jamaica Kincaid. The name of the book is The Autobiography of My Mother. And in that book, it was based in Dominica. The heroine is based in Dominica. She used a phrase which, in my view, is very apt when you describe the Caribbean's response to Cuba, or lack thereof, in the presence of the Chinese. In it, she referred to something called the honor of concubinage. Now, I know that we're not familiar with the term concubinage, and it simply means this: colonialism, and historically, persons of means, persons with financial clout, would prey, and I'm not talking about P-R-A-Y, P-R-E-Y, on lesser fortunate, impoverished women, would have affairs with them, liaisons. They would have a dingole with them, and they would try to foster in that woman who's impoverished a phenomenon of dependency. In other words, they became proud to be concubines of that economically privileged gentleman. I know that none of you is familiar with that phenomenon in Dominica. I understand that. And that is exactly what is happening when we think about China vis-a-vis Cuba. In the 1970s, when under Serafin, he sent Dispatch Bernard Wiltshire to Cuba during the meeting of an online movement. And Rosie went in his troubadourial style, and he managed to get help for Dominica, and $14 million, if my memory serves me right, of assistance and so on. But the Chinese influence has waned. Remember what happened in Grenada in 1983? The Chinese who were working at the airport, who were working in Cuba, apparently, military types, were routed by the Americans. We now have a new rich man on the block, the Chinese. The Chinese who are giving us what we could not get enough from Cuba. So there's a new ringmaster who is looking for more concubines in the region. And Dominica has reduced itself to one of those. The concubine who would give up everything to be in the good books of this new suitor, this new lover, and hence the Dewash phenomenon. Now, it was interesting that I heard the Chinese ambassador, or whoever he is, talk about the respect they have for indigenous environmental laws. And that is why all the quibish in the rivers are disappearing. That is why our dumping laws are being desecrated and disobeyed. That is why, Mr. G, the lovely mango tree you have in your yard is being raided without any sense of wrong. So we have reduced ourselves to the status of concubines. And hence, Cuba is no longer as important to us as it used to. What about the Cuban doctors? Where are they? What about those Cuban professionals or those Dominicans who were trained in Cuba? Has the local Cuban association said anything? Have they done anything? Have they raised funds? Have they given back to Cuba what Cuba gave to them? Where is the brotherly love? Where is the socialist solidarity? It's all gone. It's all gone. Because we in the Caribbean, we have very short memories. The memory is as good as the little brown pullets that patrol my mother's backyard. They remember 5 seconds and nothing else. So this is what we're having. It's not a matter of not biting the hand that feeds you. It's a matter of recognizing who's your new master. Who is your new master? And what we've done historically in Dominica over the last couple of decades, we have opened up the vault. I could use another word, but we've opened up the vault. And we've basically tell the new colonial masters, and I'm not talking about mastiff bread. I'm talking about the parrots. I'm talking about the resources. I'm talking about the desecration of the environment. I'm talking about the failure to obey our laws. Again, I refer to the ambassador who I heard a couple of days. The respect for our laws. But it's a common joke among those folks who work at the customs that the only customs law the Chinese respect is I don't speak English law. That's the only one. So while local merchants are getting their tails, having to pay increasingly exorbitant duties, they walk in with their containers because they pay the I don't speak English law. And hence we are relegated as second-class citizens in our country. And hence the whole question of Cuba has faded from our collective minds. They are no longer useful to us, or they are not as useful to us as they used to be. And therein lies the problem. No sense of collective responsibility. What we have is a pervasive amnesia about the past and about the influence of the past on the lives of Dominicans and so on. At least the Cubans could say that they aided us in a very meaningful way. At least the Taiwans could say they taught us to fish. They developed prawn farms. They didn't compete with Dominicans in making bakes. But no, our new masters compete with us at every level, but it's more than that. They set us aside. They set us aside in terms of establishing themselves in the country. And that is part of the problem. We allow ourselves to do it because we are satisfied with the status of being concubines in our own country. Thanks.
No, but Dr. Andrew, before I let you go, let's have a little follow-up on this. Does it appear then that the presence of China in the region, in the Caribbean, has caused this lack of dependency, lack of interest in supporting China, supporting Cuba? And as we can see, all this flotilla is heading to Cuba, not a dime from the Caribbean. Do you believe that it is because of the influence of China, what China has been providing for the Caribbean islands, that has caused them to have that attitude now towards Cuba?
Well, in my respectful view,
in other words, they just don't care. In other words, the fact that Trump has threatened to take over Cuba, they really don't appear to really care.
Well, they don't. And in my view, to some degree, it is attributable to the presence of the Chinese. But again, look at it from a broader geopolitical perspective, and Crispin certainly, and Alex are more conversant in this aspect of the American history than I. They're looking at it from the perspective of real politics. What can you do for us? Oh, how much can you do for us vis-a-vis the competition? And that's the problem. It's not a matter of ideology. It's not a matter of loyalty. It's not a matter of fidelity to those who've helped you. Remember South Africa? You remember during the apartheid struggle? And when they gained their independence, and Nelson Mandela was told by some Western leaders, guess what, you'd hanging out with these people? Why are you hanging out with, what's the name of the one from, is it Iraq? the Colonel Gaddafi. Why are you hanging out with these trash folks? You know what he told us? They helped us when we needed help, and we will stick with them. Who among you, our present Caribbean leaders, have taken that perspective? Tell me which one. Crispin was talking, oh no, Alvin, I'm sorry, was talking about the one from St. Lucia, the Dr. Drew. That's his Akinoy. Huh? 7 years in Cuba, he boasted. Messiah Cafe. St. Lucia is in the crosses of the Americans. Don't even talk for Brother Brown and in Antigua. I can't remember our Prime Minister's name, but I know he feels that he's safe. He's safe from that indictment filed in the South District in New York about those Caribbean politicians who aided and abetted in the movement of drugs from Venezuela to US and Europe. They're looking not just out for their pockets, but worse, they're looking out for their own skins. And hence they will touch Cuba only with a 10-foot pole, because they do not want to be associated, or worse, to be seen to be associated with Cuba, not on the very brink when your president in America, Professor Bruno and Ambassador Crispin, and the leader from Atlanta, the dean, I should say, not when he's talking about it is an honor to take Cuba. They don't want to be close to that at all. They don't want to be seen on the wrong side of contemporary history. And that is the problem with our leaders in the Caribbean. They do not have that long-term memory as someone called Nelson Mandela or others. There's no loyalty in politics. It's just self-interest. And that is the problem we face in the Caribbean.
But Mr. G, if you would allow me to piggyback a little bit on what Andrew said.
Yes.
And he spoke a little bit about political ideology, or the lack of it thereof, because there used to be a time when politics and governance would be done based on ideology. And the question is, what is the ideological pinnings of the present Dominican government, of the St. Lucian government, of the Antiguan government? There is no quite well-defined ideology. What is the ideology of our current leadership in Dominica? Who is leading the government? Where did he come from politically? Who support him now? Can you imagine the graduates? We spoke about the people who studied in Cuba who are not doing much for the Cuban regime as we speak. Who are they? Where they are? Who do they lend the political support to? And that would explain why they're not saying something about Cuba today. Our leader for our country is a rightist conservative who is leading a left-leaning social democratic movement, so to speak. Our former head of state belonged to the same ilk. Of course, Alvin can speak to that as well. And the more vociferous support we have for the current team comes from a different political ideological leaning. So we have a power sharing arrangement in Dominica that does not see ideology as a thing, but as just a convenience. So that explains where we are not just in Dominica, but in the Caribbean. At least we have socialism or communism in Cuba. We know that. We have that in China. We know that. What do we have in Dominica? What do we have in Antigua? What do we have in, well, St. Vincent has just been changed. So that is the problem. And Andre actually had his hands on the pulse, his finger on the pulse when he spoke to that. And herein lies the problem in the Caribbean and Caribbean politics, where a defined political ideology does not determine, or is not determined based on who is in office, but how they can bring an arrangement together to benefit from the blessings of the state. And I wanted to at least make that point, just to give some support to what Andre said.
Yes, and thanks for that intervention, Alex. And as I come to you, Alvin, and I know you have a lot of further thoughts on this topic, but I wanted to just make the point, that, it seems as if an American intervention in Cuba is inevitable, right? There is no clear indication of imminent military intervention, as Crispin said, but the U.S. remains engaged in diplomatic and economic tools, But any form of direct military intervention would carry significant geopolitical and regional risks. I mean, certainly we would carry a lot of risks for the Caribbean. We saw that in migration and so on. And the risks for the Caribbean are migration surges, economic spillovers, and geopolitical pressure from major powers. So this is why Caribbean should emphasize stability and dialogue. What are your thoughts, Alvin, on the sustainable path forward for Caricom in this Cuba intervention from the U.S.?
Yes, thank you, Mr. G. As my fellow panelists have so articulated, and Crispin in particular, there is no doubt, there's absolutely no doubt in our mind that any form of intervention by the U.S. in Cuba is going to have some implications for us in the region. I mean, he mentioned travel, he mentioned trade. I mean, any one of those going to impact. Bear in mind, though, that our region, Caricom, is made up of what? The 15-member Caricom made up of what? 18 million people there, about 20 million people, plus or minus. I mean, there's no doubt that there are going to be some implication. And in listening to Dr. Andre's presentation a few minutes ago, it begs the question as to whether now we're seeing just in 2020, in the 21st century, a different form of colonization, which is what is taking place. I mean, 400 years ago, they went up to Africa and wherever they went, put us on ships, take us to the islands, had us work on plantations and what have you. And what you have now, you have a new form of colonization taking place. You have the big lions in the field, China, Russia, America, fighting for turf, and the poor little islands, which are all kitten, trying to take on the lion and on the ground. That is basically what's happening. I mean, if you take any one of the islands, Jamaica, which one of them, Jamaica, I think, was the first gain independence? How many years ago? I mean, not one of them, as we speak now, Mr. G, can seriously boast of having obtained economic independence. They may have obtained what, quote unquote, political independence, in a sense, transfer one flag, the British, to whatever their flag, change the anthem from what it does to their anthem. But not one of them. Not one of them. I mean, when you have five of the countries in the sub-region, meaning the OECS, solely dependent on selling passports. Passports. They're not talking about using the fertile soil to plant rice, bananas, root crops to feed themselves and the region. They're not talking about in Dominica cases that have an abundance of water, using that water resource to supply water to Saudi Arabia and the Arab states that need water. Look, St. Lucia now is buying water from Dominica because they're in problem. There's a water crisis. They're not doing any of this. What they're doing, they're spending 10 billion with a B to import food from outside the region to inside or in here.
And primarily from the US.
And primarily from the US, exactly. So clearly we do not have anything that we can leverage, put it this way. And then what is happening, of course, and Crispin rightly put it, the US have seen the kind of resource that Cuba has, the rare earth, the nickel and the stuff that they have. I guess the Chinese now are saying, allegedly, I will say, the copper that we have in Debuash, maybe the water that we have as well that they can capitalize on, because China also have a serious water problem, fresh water that is. Okay? So, coupled with that, Mr. G, many times on this program, we talk about a lack of leadership. A lack of, and you say, well, when you say lack of leadership, what are you talking about? Gone are the days we don't have in the persons that we have leading our country today. Tell me which one. Name anyone for me. starting from Jamaica all the way down, that you could say, well, look, this guy or this woman is talking like Eric Williams, Tom Adams, Dame Eugenio, Barrow, I mean, Marisho, I mean, you name it, Bradshaw in same case. I mean, you're talking about people like Alex just asked a while ago. What is your conviction? So when you sit across the table with somebody like Marco Rubio, you can engage, you can have a conversation. When the U.S. intervened in Grenada in 1983, those of you will recall, Eugenia flew up to Washington with Reagan, and she was standing right next to Reagan when they were interviewing Reagan and interviewing her, asking, well, what is the justification? The media was there. And Reagan attempted to answer a question, and Eugenia tell him, no, step aside. You cannot answer that question. Yeah, I'm from the region. I'm going to answer the media.
Alvin, let's take a call from Lambi.
Hello?
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 Yes, go right ahead.
Yes, I keep hearing your so-called Caricom leaders referring to the Caribbean as a zone of peace. Zone of peace. Yet, the bloody idiots, anytime that so-called leader in Dominica wants them to come there and use tear gas and bullets on his people, they send them over to Dominica. What kind of zone of peace is that? These guys are a bunch of hooligans, a bunch of communists. All they want is money, and they bring in China to cause more problem in the Caribbean because they have China right in Dominica. We are in the biggest embassies, building this big airport, which will be close to America. See, they buy you hit up in the Thank you.
I suspect that Irving Andrew would like to respond to that.
but just before Irving coming, let me just before Irving coming, just before Irving coming, though, Mr. G. I mean, that is what we are confronting now in response to the question that you asked earlier about the Chinese influence in the region. Obviously, the answer is yes. There's no doubt that the Chinese presence in the region influences how and what America might or might not do. They're not happy at the fact that China is right in their backyard. I mean, so it's we are in a, how should I say, no other movie plus. And the question remains, how do we get out of it and what do we do? I believe, though, if you ask me, I will say, though, that the citizens and civic society eventually is going to rise up. There's no doubt about it. You will see an uprising throughout the region. In the 1930s, you had an uprising when poor people, most of them, 90% of them were not educated. No school, no university. But they say, you know what? We've had enough. We're not going to take more of this. And they had a uprising throughout the region, and we had what is called the Moyne Commission. You might see a similar situation happening because people are not, especially some of the young people that we tend to figure out that they're not so much involved or active. At some point, the Dominican people are going to say, no, we've had enough of that. The St. Lucian people will say, you know what, we've had enough of that. Trinidad, and it's going to be across the board. And that is what that will eventually happen.
Well, let's take another call, Lambi.
Caller, thanks for being there. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Dominica. Good evening. I'm in the brain box of Dominica, but I'm bringing my little 2 cents in it. We're talking about Caricom and lack of support to Cuba. Dominica is part of Caricom. We have water. We could export water. We could send some water to Caricom. But let me ask all you a question. What is the difference between the government of Dominica and the Cuban government? The same abuse you hear over the years in Cuba, we worse than Cuba in Dominica. Dominica now have a prime minister by the name of Roosevelt Skerrit, my brothers. My brothers, this man jailed 25 innocent people for nothing. just standing on the roadside protesting for election reform. Roosevelt carried sell over 51,000 passports, and nobody dared to ask him in Dominica how much passport he sell before he abused you. Roosevelt did something in Caricom. The same Caricom are you looking to support Cuba. Go overseas, get free guys to go right Marigot or wherever Mr. Lincoln had his home to plant false evidence. Have you ever heard that happen in the Western Hemisphere, Dr. Andre? In any other country, Roosevelt and his government would have to answer to that. And if they're found guilty, you are a judge. You know how many years they could take for that because the man's life was at risk. And Caricom stood by and said nothing. If that wasn't bad enough, that same Caricom are you asking to support Cuba? Send people, Dominica, Salisbury, to gun down people of Salisbury, to tear gas them again for the election protest, for election reform. So what the Caricom you're talking about? Caricom need to dissolve. The United Nations need to dissolve. All of them are the betrayers of America. They don't have the principle for their people to do better. It's only one thing in their mind is to protect each other. Look at Debosh. We have no strength as Dominicans to fight in Debosh. Chinese is beating us at our own game. They're telling us our scientists is not enough to tell them what they're doing is wrong. So we cannot say nothing in Cuba. The Cubans better than us. At least Cuba exporting doctors. What are we exporting in Dominica? Thank you. God bless Dominica. Thank you.
Yeah, and God bless you too. Dr. Andre, you want to respond to this last couple of callers?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with the caller before that, this last caller. I mean, my sentiments exactly, to be quite frank with you. With respect to the last caller, I think he's somewhat misguided when he thinks that we're saying that Caricom should do something. Well, we are lamenting the fact that Caricom has no vision. Caricom has abandoned its justification for being in existence. And quite frankly, Caricom, as it is now constituted, is a poor cousin of the leadership that existed in the Caribbean a couple of decades ago. And we're saying one of the main reasons for that is many of our leaders, as we speak, are more interested in protecting their own political skin than in giving hope and taking care of their own people. That's the problem. That's the crisis of leadership that we have in this region. That it's a matter of protecting themselves. It's a matter of protecting their accounts in Switzerland and in Dubai. It's a matter of protecting the expensive cars they can bring to Dominica for their gratification and for their ego. It's a matter of being able to buy condos in New York City. It's a matter of disturbing or destroying or perverting the cause of justice. It's a matter of contaminating the electoral process. Everything has one fundamental justification: longevity in power, to remain in power at any and at all costs. That is the existential crisis that exists in many of these islands, and it needs no saying, Dominica stands tall among that group of islands. So no one is protecting Cuba. And the caller is right. Cuba has a history of being generous, even if it receives assistance from other countries, but it has. But the question is simple. What does it have to show at this time for its generosity to these Caribbean countries? Those who, according to the presentation of Alvin, made a resolution, a declared resolution to come to the assistance of the Cuban people. And they have done nothing. Instead, they have been shamed by that flotilla from countries all over the place, Latin America, even the Caribbean, Europe. brought aid to people in need. And not even that, not even a bunch of bananas, not even a basket of grapefruits, not even a shipment of provisions that we have been able to send. We stand waiting to see what the US will do because we do not want to incur the wrath of the new Pharaoh in the Caribbean. Thank you.
Yes, and Crispin, since we've practically all agreed around the table.
Mr. G, there's a call. There's a call. I think Lambi.
Okay, well, let's take the call, Lambi.
Thanks, caller. Please go ahead with your call.
Hello, good night, Lambi, and Mr. G, and the members of the panel. Good night, and listeners.
Good night.
We so had a woman that we can discuss this thing on the big station, so we can enlighten people. We can inform as to what is happening in our region, in the world. And when you have crooks as leaders and as government in the Caribbean, leading people, dividing people, abusing people, looking for themselves, and so forth. And their whole mission is to get better than they came in. And not even to say that they get their salaries and they build themselves. They will sell passports and all kind of things. So their say in geopolitics is diminished because they don't have that backbone to stand and talk. Remember when the situation in Venezuela was happening, when it started, our prime minister here said he can be a negotiator. He can negotiate between the United States and Venezuela. And when Chavez was picked up, immediately he came and said that we, for so long, have not been buying gas, from Venezuela. He took himself from it. Then there was talk about Caribbean as a zone of peace. You see it becoming a zone of pieces, where our leaders are not together on anything. They are just talking brain in the region, trying to play big among the people, lie and try to distort things. But when it comes to the reality of survival in life, they look for a deal. You hear about the question of taking refugees into these countries and so on. You cannot say to the President of the United States, no, we're not doing that if you don't do this. They just don't have the backbone. So they have to run and take because they're all about deals, deal making. They're not strategic in terms of how they grow an economy, how they create opportunities. A simple example in the region, we had at some point where Prime Minister Skerritt brought Prime Minister Philip J. Pierre and Deacon Mitchell into a convention or rally they had. Then you hear about a drought in situation in St. Lucia. Then Prime Minister Skerritt can pick up his phone and call Prime Minister Philip J. Pierre and say, here it is, we can assist with the water situation. We give you so much gallon free, but we give you so much more gallon at so much a gallon. And therefore we can have this thing moving to Dominica and St. Lucia can solve the water issue. And at the same time, we can give some resources out of that. You saw where he brought Prime Minister Mayor Motley to a rally in Dublin. And she said recently that the government of Barbados is looking to see how they can subsidize petrol for the people of Barbados to cushion the impact that will hit us with the war. We haven't said anything in Dominica. So the Caribbean is not a zone of peace, it's a zone of pieces. Because you have leaders who are in deals for themselves and they're more interested in power, corrupt power, than interested in governing and leading people. You see in Antigua, for example, you see a joker there is busy in calling election. In Barbados, you have another joker calling the snap election because to them, that's what matters to them, not the survival of people and how they work together. I remember there was a time when President Clinton invited the Caribbean leaders to a meeting in Washington. And then when he sent out the agenda to them, Eugene Charles said, no, I'm not involved with anybody in the Caribbean. I'm not involved with political matters, which is closer to me. I'm not coming to Washington to discuss arms and so on. I will come to discuss bananas. And they had to change the agenda. But here in this time, these leaders cannot do it because they have no backbone. They're looking for deals. So now they have really turned their back on Cuba. You see them withdrawing this and withdrawing that and cutting this and cutting that because, as far as they're concerned, they have mouth, but when it comes to stand for what is reality, they run and hide and so on. So really, the Caribbean have become a zone of pieces, and it's so unfortunate at this time. So thank you, gentlemen, for discussing this topic. I feel it's so refreshing that the people of the Caribbean can hear from you all. We have a Minister of Foreign Affairs. I don't know whether he is in where he is. We just don't hear. We have all of the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying something, but ours, we can't hear him, we can't see him. He's lost. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that contribution. And let's go to Crispin. Well, I think Crispin can speak for the foreign affairs ministers of the region on this issue. Crispin, it appears that, well, for the time being, it appears that the U.S. intervention in Cuba is more or less at the level of diplomacy. So, Senator Marco Rubio is talking nice and so on to the fellows in the background to see if they will accommodate what Donald Trump wants there. But I mean, we know that Caricom is silent. Caricom is not doing a fat because, Caricom depends to a large extent for its imports from the United States. Caricom depends on cruise ships from the United States coming in and into the ports and spending a few dollars. Caricom depends on this large diaspora in the U.S. sending home huge amounts of remittances every year, and which is sustaining many of the people in the region. So really, what it is that Caricom can do, we saw that Kamala Prasad, used her smarts and went the other way, put herself with the U.S. and complained that Venezuela was pushing drugs into the country and creating all kind of problems for them and threatening them. So she put herself on the side of the U.S. But it seems as if this U.S. intervention and some kind of U.S. takeover is inevitable in Cuba. So, Crispin, what do you think would be the most sustainable path forward? I mean, it is probably engagement or isolation, probably regional cooperation, gradual reform in Cuba by, international dialogue engagement, and certainly to avoid isolation. And what do you think that Cuba should do in terms of the way forward, in terms of, governance?
Yes. Well, before I address that second part of your question, I wanted to go back to China and the China-Cuba relations, because that is really what is driving the U.S. focus on China. And I wanted to kind of give a kind of a summary of that. Diplomatic relations between Cuba and China has been going on for 65 years. They established diplomatic relations in 1960. Now, during that time, the Soviet Union was really very powerful, and Cuba had there was a divide between Moscow and Beijing, in that you had the Mao line, and you had the Soviet centralism, democratic centralism line. I guess Alex and Dr. Andrew would be familiar with those terms. So the Chinese, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Chinese got friendlier with Cuba. And both countries were showing a commitment to socialism and mutual support against external pressures, particularly coming from the US. So there are three areas that I think are important for us to frame what to expect going forward with Cuba and the US. One of them is this military cooperation between China and Cuba, which has grown substantially in the last 20 years, with discussions focusing on exchanges of personnel and joint military training. In fact, there was a recent joint military training between Cuba and the Chinese, and they rehearsed a possible intervention of China in Taiwan. So that gives you a flavor of the kind of things that is going on. Definitely the Cubans and the Americans would like to counter the influence of the US in the Caribbean. In the arena of economic relations, China remains Cuba's second largest trading partner after Russia. And however, in the last 10 years, there's been a decrease in the trading volumes between Havana and Beijing, and it's more weighted to the Chinese dominance in that trade partnership. So there's a huge imbalance, right, in trade, and Cuba has been further challenged by the sanctions of the US. So it's hampering their ability to produce goods that they can trade with Cuba, with China. So that is one of the problems. But China has been investing in nickel development. Cuba has large reserves of nickel, which they used to make coins and other metals, other things. And Cuba also has offshore oil, significant offshore oil, which the Chinese have invested in exploring. So exploration is going on for oil by the Chinese in Cuba. The other thing that the other arena is with cultural and scientific exchanges. Cultural and scientific exchanges. The two countries have been working very closely in these areas of cultural exchange and scientific collaboration. And then now that the direct flights from China into Cuba and tourists from China being exempt from visa requirements, it's aimed at bolstering people-to-people connections and tourism between the two countries. And the last thing I want to say on that China-Cuba relationship has to do with the direct outcome of the military cooperation is real concern in Washington that this relationship between China and Cuba has adverse implications for U.S. policy and the whole Don Roe doctrine, the Donald Trump doctrine in Latin America. It is seen as a counter. So these are some of the things driving that concern with the U.S. and wanting to intervene in Cuba. Now, as to some of the points you raised, Mr. G, about Caricom, and I know that Alvin spoke about what could we be exporting to China and those kind of things. Well, the first thing that we have to appreciate is that it's not a total win-win for China in the Caribbean. It's a 9-5. By that I mean 9 of our Caricom countries have diplomatic relations with China and have adopted the One China policy. There are 5 other countries that have not. And I believe that Washington is going to encourage that and encourage more countries to pull away from One China policy. Assuming a change of government in Dominica, it's not unthinkable that the Americans could say to a new government in Dominica that we want you to reestablish relations with China, with Taiwan. That's not unthinkable. It happened in St. Lucia under John Compton. The problem is that when a country has adopted One China, it's almost like a treaty, and breaking it has implications. I mean, St. Lucia, when they broke the relationship with Beijing and went back to Taiwan under John Compton, the Chinese said to them, stay there. when the government changed, Kenny Anthony came back. The Chinese said, you can't come back to one China right now, partner. You're going to have to stay with Taiwan. And that's what happened. I expect that that could play out in the region with other countries. Okay, it's really concerning to me how quickly the Caricom countries have yielded to the pressure of Marco Rubio. He has these Caribbean leaders dancing in the palm of his hand. If he tell them to go on Zuke, they will do that. If he tell them go on Rumba, that's what they'll do next. So right now he has two prime ministers in the region, like two puppets on a string. One is in Roseau, the other one is in St. John's, Antigua. And he's making these two puppets dance. I really wish I could do those kind of dance, to be honest. But he has these two guys in a box. And when he said, sir, do you want visas for your people? Yes, Mr. Rubio, yes. Well, sir, you're going to have to take some deportees if you want that. And not only that, sir, your citizens now have to pay a bond to get a visa, and that could be as much as $15,000. So when the Mr. Rubio now tells these two puppets that they must now do more, and they'll say, sir, how high should I jump for you? Because whatever you tell me to do, sir, you are the king right now, and my allegiance is to the new king. So that's the problem that the Caribbean countries are facing in 2026. At the end of the first quarter of this 21st century, we have Caribbean leaders bowing as though they are still slaves at master's table in 2026. That is the reality that the Caribbean countries are now facing. Now, one might argue they don't have any other choice. And maybe that's true. But you don't just yield to the bear like that. You have to find a way to deal with that bear in a way that does not destroy your dignity and your respect and your people's respect. So, Mr. G, we're facing a very pessimistic period ahead, and I am worried that it's going to create grave instability that we have not even foreseen, nor have we even thought about. And all I can see where everything points to is a collision between the two powers in the Caribbean. The US and China are going to collide in the Caribbean. How it's going to happen, I don't know. But I can see that if a change of government is forced upon Cuba, we will see a response from the Chinese.
You know, Dr. Andre, we have seen the experience of the Strait of Hormuz, where, you know, all the ships are held to ransom. And do you think that the fact that China has such a dominant presence in the Caribbean today, do you think that the U.S. might be concerned that Caribbean waters might develop into that same sort of situation if they intervene in Cuba?
Of course, they are very concerned. Of course, they've put pressure on the Panamanian government to reduce the influence of the Chinese insofar as the Panama Canal is concerned. Even with respect to the Strait of Hormuz, some of the U.S. technocrats and, you know, the talking heads have proposed building a similar passage for the movement or the transportation of oil from the Middle East to their destinations. And that is very much on the minds of the United States, the extent to which the Chinese have exerted or are influencing or are exerting influences over the island governments. Now, thank God we don't have the largest intelligence infrastructure in the Eastern Caribbean. Do you think that's a secret to our North American neighbors? Don't you think that the vast intelligence gathering apparatus and infrastructure or architecture of the US have given them all the information, or should I say ammunition, they need as to the existential threat posed by a serious competitor in the Caribbean? And do you think the policy now persecuted by Donald Trump, DOMRO, which is an echo of the policy in the past, that is to say, we control everything that goes on in our backyard, do you think that they will just sit down meekly and let their rivals establish pockets of influence in the region? We in Dominica, we're doing that because, I mean, there's no hue and cry over Wesley. Take it. There's no hue and cry. Well, that's not wrong, to be fair. You have an indigenous movement on the ground protesting, quite frankly, what's happening at Des Branches, and protesting the justification for that. That is, they're looking for stones. They want to dig as deep as a couple hundred, is it a couple hundred feet or is it 1,000 feet into the ground? They're looking for stones. I don't know about Alex, but growing up, when you want the stone to go after a mango, you just pick up one on the side of the road. You don't dig anywhere to get the stones. You don't dig anywhere on the western coast. You don't dig anywhere in Point Michel. But of all places, which is rumored to have copper deposits, you want to destroy a whole mountain on the pretext that you want stones for your airport. You say salt gas. But thank God, as I said, there's an indigenous movement that is saying this is nonsense. We're not standing up for this, you know, because they read the story of some book of fiction in which some fellow called David took up his catapult, you know, and defeated forces which were aligned or arrayed against him, you know. So of course they are. But the fact of the matter is, all is not lost, and that is the message that we have to convey to those in our region. All is not lost. We can still maintain our dignity. We can still put up a fight to protect what is dear and sacred to us as an independent nation. Let me just give you a story, you know. You know, Elaine, we had always had a few dogs. They belong to everyone but to no one. The baddest dog, when you run, he'll run at you and bite the little khaki pants that you have. But when you stand up with a bag of marshmallow in your hands ready to throw at him, it takes off. And that is the irony of power, or the response to power. It's only a reaction that commands respect. And I think that is the dilemma the Americans are facing with Iran. They didn't expect that kind of response. How do they call it? Asymmetric response. But the Iranians have clearly stated, we can't compete with you all on your big bombs and your $1 million bombs, but we will use our $5,000 little drones, and we will adopt a scorched earth policy. And that's why you have the American president, whether it's fake news or otherwise, talking about talks with Iran, because they look at the big picture and they see what that little guy can do against the might of two countries, both of them nuclear countries. And they're putting up a fight with what they have. They don't want to be in the realm or to be regarded as being or having the honor of being a concubine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Andrew. Well, look, we're down to our closing remarks. Alvin, your closing remarks at this time.
Well, thank you, Mr. G. Let me just thank you again for inviting me to this conversation, and to thank my fellow panelists, Alex, Crispin, Irvin, you know, for their contributions. I think they made some very splendid contributions this evening. And to Lambie on the console, and to the callers who called. I think all the callers called made some very valuable inputs and contribution. And as I've always done in the past, Mr. G, I always want to end on a sense of hope. And that is where I think Irving just sort of contributed in his remarks a few minutes ago. All is not lost. And I agree with him entirely on that. There has to be a sense of hope. Once we live as a people, I mean, think of it this way, Mr. G, if the slaves that was so brutally treated 400 years on those plantations had said, you know what, all is lost, and there was no hope, those of us who are here today as descendants of those persons would not be alive. If the Bala and the Congo and all those folks who stood up in Dominica, the Kalinago people, we would not be there today. And that is why I believe, Mr. G, notwithstanding where the Boys and the Girls Club have brought us over the last couple of years, those who call themselves leaders in the region, notwithstanding where they have taken us as a people, I think as a people, we are going to respond. I may not be there. I'm like I told you already, I'm with you in the departure lounge. Folks like Alex and Irvin and my friend Crispin are still there, but you and I are in the departure lounge. So like they say, for me, mene nouvelle, Banu, but I am almost convinced. Yeah. I'm almost convinced that the people of this region are not going to lie and play dead. They will resist. And it's going to show itself in several forms. Right now, we're focusing on the political leaders, put it this way, the government. But there are several other organizations that will not have a choice, but to lend their voice and to uprise. The churches, the trade unions, we'll see it again. I'm telling you, I may not be there, but trade unions, the churches, these groups are going to. And I commend the folks in Dominica. Look who we have leading that debauch cause in Dominica. Two young geologists. And with Nasio and the rest of the crew. So I'm hopeful that, notwithstanding what Cuba is going through, that somewhere or somehow we will be able to respond to that, even if maybe not on a collective basis. We may not be able to do it. They may not be able to do it as Caricom, but Dominica should be able to send a few badge of water, some water to water is life. Send some water to the Cuban people from Dominica, whatever we have. So again, thank you, Mr. G, and my fellow panelists. It's always a pleasure to add my little voice, my little 5 cents to the conversation. And I look forward to engaging again at some time again in the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alvin. Since we're on this theme of hope, Alex, I mean, in Grand Bay, for example, I mean, there was hope because Philip Francis, better known as UNICEF, and all the other people of Grand Bay stood up to the Geneva Estate, and the people of Grand Bay got land from the Geneva Estate. So your closing remarks, Alex?
Yeah, well, I agree with Alvin, and I would imagine the other members of the panel would share the same view. And I know Lambi shares that view as well. That as long as there's life, there is hope, and we are going to be just fine. Alvin spoke about what seems to be a very strategic, small, but very important movements taking place at Debranche. And I was asked to offer an opinion on a speech or statement made by the ambassador for China. And I did give that opinion. And you don't get an ambassador making a statement if this is not something serious. So you may not have a mass number of people, but the stance is effective enough to warrant a statement from an ambassador of a major superpower. It is often said that Dominicans talk too much, but if we were not talking as much, we would have had chaos, we would have been fighting, we would have gone to blows. And a program like tonight's program, I'm here just enjoying this program to the utmost, just listening to my comrades express views that I agree with. Even if I don't say what they're saying, but they're saying it for us. So I'm happy, Mr. G, that you convened such a wonderful panel of individuals. And you allow us 2 hours plus to speak on very important issues. And I can only imagine how the audience is taking in this information. I think Dominica is better for this program tonight. And I want to remind us that protest is not always taken to the streets. What we are doing there, the words in action, that is a form of protest as well. And indeed, we had a very great demonstration of literary protest, talking about the things that we felt we should talk about in a way that is agreeable. No one got angry tonight, including our listeners, but we spoke about some very serious issues. And I'm happy and honored, Mr. G, that I was among the panel, and I'm looking forward to future engagements. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alex. And as I go to Crispin, let me just acknowledge all the people who are with us on Facebook and on YouTube and on the internet, on the radio, in their vehicles, at their homes. Thank you for staying with us tonight on this important topic for the region at this point in time. Crispin, your closing remarks?
Yes. Well, I wanted to focus my closing remarks on a question that you raised, which is what is the most sustainable path forward given this Cuba-US reality? My hope was that the Caricom countries would be forward-looking and take the initiative to engage the U.S. at the highest level, whether it's a delegation of leaders who would make a demarche in Washington to the White House. That we have not seen that, but I think that the voice of Caricom is actually critical now. But we face the challenge of the cohesion of the region, of the member states, is not there anymore, largely because of the stance taken by Guyana and Trinidad. It is not an easy endeavor for them to manage. I mean, when the world superpower is telling you this, they want this done, you better yield and do what you're told. But if the 14 Caricom states had banded together and there was no dissension in their ranks in terms of how to engage with the US, I think they would be in a better position. Now, having said that, what I think is desired is not a military intervention in Cuba, but a diplomatic offensive by the Americans to get the Cubans talking in a serious way about the future of Cuba in the region. And when we can get to that, that would be much better than a military kind of intervention, because a military intervention will have implications that we have not foreseen. And so I think, I don't know what the leaders are doing now, what has happened since they had the meeting with Secretary of State Marco Rubio in St. Kitts. But it'll be important for the Caribbean countries not to cower and hide, but rather state their position. Do it diplomatically. They don't have to come out and do it in public. Do it behind the scenes, but start engaging the US in a way that you're not a subservient client state. So that's all I hope will happen. I just hope that we wouldn't have war, but it seems, given what we've seen in the last months, particularly with Iran, we can begin to get ready for an intervention, a military kind of intervention in Cuba.
Thank you, Crispin, for speaking so eloquently for the foreign affairs ministers of the region in terms of the approach that they should be adopting with the US. And of course, you recommended that the leaders in CARICOM should have made their way to the White House to have a discussion about the future of the region. So thank you very much for that. Dr. Andre, you have the final word?
Well, let me commend the panelists. I think that they were all brilliant, quite frankly. But then again, we didn't expect anything less. You have the professor, you have the ambassador, you have the dean of Atlanta, you have Sam Lambie, looking like a biblical scholar with his beard. Quite frankly, I'm not sure about the hat, but at least the beard. And you have yourself, who set this thing up and so on. But I think what we in the Caribbean should do or can do at no cost is to remind the Americans of their own sordid history in the region, and to remind them of their own recent history, their intervention in Afghanistan, their intervention in Iraq, and others, to put a reserve, a hold on Israel. Because what happens when you create a power vacuum? What happens when you, I think it was Crispin's phrase, decapitate the leadership in a country? Inevitably, what happens? Chaos ensues. And you know, the sad part of it is, this is not change motivated by democracy or principles of democracy. Because look at what he did in Venezuela. He took out Maduro and left Maduro second in command. And he ignored the lady who apparently, by all credible accounts, won the last election in Venezuela.
And gave him her Nobel Peace
The Nobel Peace, Nobel Prize, and the Nobel people say, Gaston, you can't do that. We don't recognize that. You know, look at the chaos. Latin America is a prime example. When they depose a democratically elected leader and you put a dictator, thousands of people literally disappear. And this is not fiction. It's not in America's interest to create that kind of chaos in its own backyard. It's not in his interest to create that vacuum where another power that is competing with you can come in and offer these leaders trinkets like they did in the days of slavery. Offer some of the black leaders trinkets, what we used to call bebel growing up, and then take your land, and then take what you have, and then take your resources and create what is called a debt trap. Speak to them about the history and about their real self-interest. Huh? Diplomacy achieves much more. You achieve much more with honey than vinegar, quite frankly. And let's face it, the Cuban people will be grateful for you if you can alleviate suffering in their own country. That is the language of decency, of diplomacy. They should relearn, because they've been a very generous country historically. Look at what they did to Europe after World War II. They have to rediscover their own roots. And we in Dominica and in the Caribbean, we have to discover our own strengths, our moral strengths, our values, those principles that we stand on. Ask ourselves, to what extent are we prepared to preserve those values, those principles of decency, of democracy, of fighting against poverty? Have we forgotten this? Have we lost that spirit, that enthusiasm, that, whether it's biblical or otherwise, that Kudme spirit, that African belief that it takes a village to raise a child, so it will take a town or country to ensure that everyone is doing well? That principle underlying that so-called miracle of what, 3 loaves and 2 pieces of bacadec feeding 5,000 people. That spirit of sharing. Huh? That spirit of sharing, which tells you that instead of spending $65,000 on rent, you should improve the wages of your own people. Where has it gone? Are we content to live in a situation where we simply enjoy the honor of concubinage? I don't think so. I think there's a lot of good people, hardworking people. When I go to Dominica, I meet some of them, give them a little job if I can, buy their goods, eat their mastiff and their penny bread, to be quite frank with you. You know, because it's only through supporting those folk that you give them a little hope. $5 to you may not mean anything, but it means a lot to those who hunger for righteousness and decency and a little food to feed their children. So on that note, I take my leave. I've probably spoken too much. There's many people out there listening say, "Oh, you talk too much." Well, at least it's better to talk than to do nothing. So I applaud the efforts of those who speak and continue to speak, despite those who may not see the significance of speaking. So I thank you, Mr. G. I thank all the panelists again. In my view, a fantastic job. Lambi, I thank you. And Sherwin, who is in the background, but just as important as everybody else. So good evening and God bless.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Andre. And thank you, Crispin. Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Alex. Thanks a lot to Lambi and Sherwin behind the scene running the operation. And of course, thanks to those folks who are with us on the radio, on internet, on Facebook and on YouTube with us tonight. I'm pretty sure that none of those people who are with us listening think that you talk too much, Dr. Andre. As a matter of fact, I believe most of them believe that they love hearing you talk, and I think Dominicans appreciate you.
Well, as a matter of fact, Mr. G, one of those they say, I just love this program. It should be twice a week. So much education in a short time. That's one of your persons there, so.
Yes. Yeah, so we appreciate you all on the YouTube and Facebook and on listening on the radio. And you just left for me to say good night, gentlemen. I mean, everybody have a very pleasant evening. It was nice being with you tonight, and let's hope we can meet again soon on another topic. Good night.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Yeah.
The Global View on Q, the big station. Insights into where the people of Dominica and the Caribbean came from. Understanding our past. Embracing our present. Charting the way forward into our future. Together, eliminating poverty. Embracing justice, peace, and togetherness. The Global View on Q. Networking.